Welcome to Shifting Ground, the podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Join us every other week as our editors connect the pages of Orbis with the issues of the day.
I'm Nick Vosdev, a professor at the Naval War College and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
And I'm Larry Rubin, an associate professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology.
Together, we serve as editors of Orbis, the Journal of World Affairs.
Each episode will speak with scholars, policymakers, and practitioners about the forces reshaping global politics, international security, and world affairs.
You can find this and future episodes of Shifting Ground on our website, orbisjournal.org, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major streaming services. Please note that the views expressed by the hosts and participants in this episode are their own. This is Shifting Ground.
Nick and I are pleased to welcome today Admiral Sandy Winnefeld to the Orbis podcast. Admiral Winnefeld served as the 9th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and previously held a wide range of operational and strategic leadership roles across the U.S. military. He's also a distinguished professor of practice at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And over the course of his career, he's been deeply engaged in thinking about the relationship between military strategy, global order, and long-term geopolitical trends. In a recent essay in Orbis, he introduces the idea of the global operating system to describe the framework of rules, institutions, and norms that underpin international stability and cooperation. Today, we'll talk about that concept, how it relates to the rules-based international order, and what it might tell us about the trajectory of global politics today. First of all, we want to start a little bit to get to know you and also introduce you to our listeners. He's coming to us today from Florida, from sunny Florida, which you can't see right now. And welcome to the show, Sandy.
Larry and Nick, it's a delight to be with both of you today, and can't wait to get into our discussion.
Before we get into this, into talking about strategy and international order, I want to start with something a little bit different. You have a strong background in STEM, spent your career in a highly technical profession at the highest levels of leadership. How did this science and technology background or training help in the way you think about strategy, the way you think about world politics, and also leadership as well?
Well, Larry, it's a good question. There are really sort of two different threads. One thing that was very useful to me and has been at every stage of my career was a Georgia Tech engineering education that taught me, rigor. It taught me to challenge the assumptions. It taught me to sort of what I call rowdy engineering. And sort of gave me a systematic way, loosely, of approaching the world. But the whole piece on strategic issues and the like sort of has been something that's grown throughout my career. And it started, just by reading a lot when I was a young guy, young fighter pilot, curious about the world, that kind of thing. And then I did a tour on the Joint Staff in the Operations Directorate that was during the first Gulf War. And it's just natural that you sort of absorb a lot about strategy and policy and how military force interacts with the other elements of national power. In a job like that, even though I was pretty young, I was the lieutenant commander in the Navy. And then that sort of fused, and I kept reading a little bit more. I actually attended the Naval War College off-campus program, so it's great to be here with Nick. That was a fantastic program. I think the former ROTC instructor at Georgia Tech named Porter Halliburton, who was also a former POW, sort of ran that program when I was going through it, and he's a wonderful mentor. And then further along in my career, I did a job as the Joint Staff, lead for strategic plans and policy for Admiral Mike Mullen when he was the chairman as a 3-star admiral, and then went off to be a combatant commander at Northern Command, and then came back as the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And at every step of the way, I got to do more things, like more White House Situation Room meetings and more papers I had to write and read. And it just sort of grew over time. And in the process, I think it was really important in my mind. I've always wanted to find a structured approach to things so that I can think more clearly about them. And that traces all the way back to what I just started with, which was a Georgia Tech education.
To build on Larry's question, in the military, you start out at the tactical level You learn tactical excellence, how to achieve taking the hill, taking the beach. You move up to the operational, and then you finally reach the strategic level where it's all put together. And as you said, this is where the military instrument of power integrates with all other instruments of national power. To what extent do you think that in our strategic community in the US, whether among military or civilians or both, we are losing some of that thread of the connection between tactical excellence all the way to strategic success?
Well, I think back when I was doing this, the sort of table was set for you as a young officer, and it was your choice as to whether you were going to eat. If you pardon the terrible analogy there, it was like there were plenty of opportunities to learn at every level, an increasing level of sophistication about moving from tactical to operational to strategic levels. And if you chose not to do it, then that was your choice. But it was all laid out like a wonderful buffet, including the Naval War College, including other entities, the nuclear power school, that sort of thing. So I do think you're asking an important question, and that is how good are we still at teaching our young officers of all the services to think strategically. And that's not something you just do overnight. You don't take a course in strategy and the next thing you know, you're a brilliant strategist. There's an awful lot of knowledge that has to be absorbed that sort of stitches itself together in your mind. And like any other discipline in the world, whether it's medicine or whatever, you grow that knowledge, but it takes constant learning. And we need to make sure we're doing that with this generation of officers.
Kind of as a transition to something I really want to talk about a bit more is your own, you have your own podcast, the Adrenaline Zone, and also you have a Substack with a video feed with your son who's also in the military right now. And I'm just curious if this kind of obviously these conversations live for everybody to talk about geopolitics and other things, including the most recent episode that I remember, the application of stoicism to understand not to have to respond to things, which is a very interesting and important lesson these days. But really, how has this kind of informed these conversations with your son and this new generation? Some of your thoughts on what you just how you just answered Nick.
Sure, and I'll start with the Adrenaline Zone, which I'm really delighted to do with a former Georgia Tech PhD and retired astronaut named Sandy Magnus, and that's about people who take risk, and it's really been fun. We've done 80 episodes, and it's interesting. A friend of mine who used to be the executive director of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board for me actually has gone back to his intelligence agency, and he ran a Clyde analysis on all 80 episode transcripts to see if he could tease out the major lessons learned coming from all these risk takers of many different types. So that's going to be a future Substack post because it's so interesting to see what Claude came up with. But specifically to your question with my son, he is a very thoughtful young man. He's a Marine Corps artillery officer, and he's going through an expeditionary warfare school right now. He's getting his master's in analytics at Georgia Tech online at the same time. So this kid is thinking. And he came up to me and said, "Dad, I want to do something with you. While you're still around, I want to do something with you. So let's start a Substack." And we decided that there would be sort of several threads to this thing. One would be threads about leadership. So we've got a whole series in there that aren't necessarily podcasts. They're actual articles on 20 different topics regarding leadership. Another one was his personal interest in stoicism. So what you read over the weekend was actually his product. And then strategy, what's going on in the world and how does it mesh with sort of fundamental principles of how the world is organized, how we ought to think about using national elements of power and that sort of thing. So we're having a blast with that. We've been doing it for 3 or 4 months, and we've got a whole bunch of material out there. And it's really gratifying to be able to do something like that with my son.
I guess now it's a good time to transition a bit to talk about your most recent essay, or your recent essay in Orbis that we have coming out. And in particular, we're really struck, I think, by your renaming or conceptualization of global operating system, which you prefer over international order, and I support that too. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you mean by this concept?
Sure. There are a couple of threads here. One, when Marty Dempsey, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the same time I was the vice chairman, he and I got along really well, which isn't always the case, frankly, with the chairman and vice chairman, but he and I got along really well. And we knew that we had to provide advice to the president and the secretary of defense on, whether, how, and when to use military force mixed in with all other elements of national power, like economic power, informational power, diplomatic power, intelligence power, and the like. And we didn't want to make it up as we went along. There are a lot of people, say in the White House Situation Room, who will blurt something out that says, "Hey, that's a vital interest of the United States. We need to use force." And there's not a lot of why behind the what. And we wanted to be more thoughtful because, there are lives of young men and women at stake. And like, so we came up with a system that we used to advise ourselves on how to make these recommendations. And it was all based on a set of prioritized, enduring, and abstract national security interests. And they were prioritized because the U.S. can't do everything in the world all at the same time. You have to make choices. They were abstract because that led to the discipline of getting to the true why behind the what, rather than just, hey, the Strait of Hormuz is a vital national interest. Well, why is it a vital national interest? We wanted to fall back on abstract fundamental principles. And then enduring was because we didn't want to just, have it shift with the political winds every time something changed. So those 5 interests were: number 1, survival of the nation; number 2, prevention of catastrophic attacks on the nation, like a 911 or a one-off nuclear weapon; third was the protection of this global operating system, which I'll get into in just a second; and third was secure, confident, reliable allies and partners; and fifth was protection of, and maybe even extension where possible, of universal values. And we would take a given situation, say Iran, and we would cast it against that list of national security interests to see where the intersections were, and where the intersections were with high interests or many interests, or whether the situation intersected an interest very deeply. We would call that high correlation. And where there was high correlation, we would be advocates for using national instruments of power and military force as a last resort. And then with extremely high correlation, you could argue we would recommend that using 5 sort of risk variables, acting unilaterally. We obviously usually prefer to act with allies, doing so at cost of American blood, doing so at the cost of American treasure, doing so at opportunity cost, where if I do something over here, I might not be able to do something over there. And then last, the sort of cost of pushing hard against international law. And the higher the correlation, the more willing we would be to do those things, and the lower the correlation, the less willing we would be able to do those things. And there was a caveat that went along with this: is be careful about protecting low correlation if in so doing you threaten a higher interest, which has a lot to do with, say, we were careful in Ukraine, which was maybe a medium level interest because the opponent there has nuclear weapons. So we didn't want to threaten that number 1 interest. So back to and that's a long introduction to the answer to your question, the global operating system. A lot of people think of it only in terms of the rules-based international order that was put in place after World War II. And I always wanted to include the global economy separately there because it's so important. It's what, the rules-based international order has kind of kept us secure since World War II. And the global economic system has kept us prosperous since. There's more to it in terms of long wave cycles, but we can get into that perhaps in a bit.
I wanted to pull a bit more on the thread of the concept of the global operating system, which I think is a very useful concept, because a rules-based system implies enforcers. It implies that there's some degree of volition in whether it works or not. But an operating system runs like software, right? It powers the machine and it makes it function. And your point about the global economy has gotten me thinking about that, which is that we have so many aspects of our lives which depend on a whole set of global operating systems, whether it's air travel, whether it is regulation of the internet, whether it's currency transactions, so that I can go anywhere in the world with a credit card and be able to pay for goods and services. And yet we don't pay attention, or we don't recreate these systems every time that we need them. And so your sense about the global operating system, I mean, how much volition on the part of states and governments is required? How much becomes almost automatic? And perhaps this will tie into the geopolitical cycles, which is, are we now seeing in the events of 2026 what happens when that global operating system is disrupted?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point. And one of the reasons why this global operating system is so defenseless right now is because it has relied on volition from the leading power, the United States. You knew that the authoritarian powers like Russia and China were going to manipulate that system to their benefit, and to a certain extent, the United States has done so as well, but not on a broad and grand scale. And in general, country, we've had more allies than any other nation in history, because people trusted us to stick by, voluntarily to the system that we actually put in place, and we did so partly because it benefited us. And one of the questions is, in these long wave geopolitical cycles, the latest of which began after World War II, and the history part of this is fascinating. We put it in place and we've benefited. If a cycle is in decline, generally the established power that put the cycle in place is struggling a little bit and is tempted to maybe take some of that volition out of that rules-based international order, which can only accelerate the decline. And it's frightening to me to see this happen. And the five or so things that cause these cycles to come to an end, and it's always a catastrophic end, is a rising power that's very ambitious and usually authoritarian, that has a lot of freedom to act because it has control of its own people. And then an established power that overextends itself financially, that overextends itself militarily, in which political divisions are deepening, and in which there are generations that forget the bloody cost of the catastrophic end of these cycles. And towards the end, you start seeing the rule of power dominating over the rule of law. And we've always felt that the rule of power is always best when backed by the rule of law. But when that no longer happens, things start to unravel. And that is really worrisome to me right now. And when you consider these long wave cycles, consider the one that started at the end of the 30 Years War in Europe. The Peace of Westphalia, put in place by statesmen who put something together that was intended to never let this happen again. And then 150 years later, you have the Napoleonic Wars, another bloody catastrophe. And the Europeans put in place the Concert of Europe, which was intended to never let this happen again. And now 100 years later, you have World War I and World War II, same thing. Statesmen put together a system, maybe the global operating system, it doesn't have a formal name, where this was designed to never happen again. The cycles always end. And how close are we to the end of this one is something that worries me very much. And it's incumbent on us as Americans, as leaders, to try to push that out as far as we can. And as a side note, I would suggest that these cycles are growing shorter over millennia. And the only reason I can think of, and it would be really interesting to get some real academic research into this, is that communications are so much more ubiquitous than they were in previous cycles, and things just tend to move faster. But that would be a great project for a Georgia Tech PhD candidate, I should say.
Well, that's great, actually, because one of the goals or measures of what we're trying to do as well with this podcast and relaunching Orbis that way, or setting this, and certainly from these initial pieces, is setting the research agenda. So I hope people are taking notes on that as well. And I want to push a little bit, it kind of along the same types of lines, and to ask the question about another thing that you discussed, which is the fiscal pressures and political polarization, the military overextension that can lead or directly, indirectly, to some of the domestic dynamics, which affect the durability of the international order, but not international order, global operating system.
There you go. Whatever you
how
want to call
basically right, whatever we want to call it. How do we understand this relationship between domestic politics, which you spoke about a little bit before, and the global operating system?
Yeah, so I'm very, very careful as a retired senior military officer to stay out of domestic politics. And there's a really good reason for that. One is, I mean, if I get very political, then people are going to wonder if I was political while I was actually in my last job as vice chairman. And that would cause them to wonder if the current guys are political. And I can assure you, we are not. I was not. They are not. So I'm cautious about that, but that doesn't mean I can observe it and form my own opinions about the why of what's happening. And I think one of the things that is causing these deeper divisions is the ubiquity. I think there are a couple of cycles that have happened. We started after World War II with, in terms of American political opinion, with kind of a hump in the middle. Think of a bell curve where you had some people a little bit on the right, people a little bit on the left, but generally people were in the center. And then when 24-hour news media came out, the purveyors of that realized that there was intense competition, and in order to secure a decent size of that market share, so that's how you ended up with more liberal 24-hour news media and more conservative 24-hour news media, and they've got their own camps. And now you've built an echo chamber where people listen to those and are influenced. So that hump divided into two humps that started to kind of spread apart. And then when social media came along, each of those two humps broke into two humps. And now you have a far right and a far left and a moderate right and a moderate left and kind of a little hump in the center, which is kind of where I am. The social media piece has really accelerated and accentuated those differences. And now any idiot can go viral in those places, where going all the way back to the single hump, generally, there was some responsibility there that was sort of self-imposed by the media companies. So I think that's a major factor in why we're seeing so many deep political divisions in our country.
Well, this sort of goes back to a point you just raised with us, right, which is the change in communications, the change in the speed, the change in the access, the change in the removal of filters and of gatekeepers, so to speak, and that anyone can contribute positively or negatively, informed or misinformed, into the dialogue. And that got me thinking in terms of cycles, right? Because you were talking about communications, and I'm thinking of these cycles, and to bring it back to this larger question. So we have this technological cycle that we've been living through, which has compressed our communications, which has compressed our ability to reach out and touch each other. How does this fit in with your view of kind of the geopolitical cycles that we're living through? We talk about a kind of the end of the Second World War and then the end of the Cold War as beginnings and ends of cycles. Are we now, in your sense, embarking on a new set of geopolitical and geoeconomic cycles moving forward?
I think what we're seeing in the sort of framework that I have in my mind is the end of a cycle. That some of the things you're talking about, the technological piece, the more ubiquitous communications and so on, are just amplifying the factors that tend to cause cycles to end catastrophically. So the real question is, what comes next? Is there who's going to be the dominant geopolitical player in the next cycle? Is it still going to be the United States if we can salvage this, or is it going to be China, which has its own internal contradictions and challenges? There's not a linear increase that's ever going to happen with China, and we're already seeing it kind of fold over a little bit. You notice that their economic growth projections this year were the most modest ever, at a stupefying 3 to 4%, which we would love to have in the United States, but they don't necessarily tell the truth. The point being, what I worry about is the catastrophic end of a current cycle, and you can see several different ways this could unfold, one of which would be a major crisis in the Pacific that is resolved using force or escalates into a major world war. It's not contained at all, that sort of thing. And this crisis in Iran is a very good warning signal for us. Something that people were making assumptions that because they never have in the past, they're not going to attack regional nations. Because they never have in the past, they're not going to close the Strait of Hormuz. But people didn't realize that this time was different. It was actually talking about eliminating a regime, and when you particularly and when I talk about regime change in the United States, we're talking about elections where the losers go work in think tanks. When you have regime change in a place like Iran or China or Russia, the losers die, and so they become a little bit more desperate when you say we're going to change your regime, and they're going to keep on fighting. So until their regime survival can be assured, if in fact that's going to happen. But this is pretty. It's a good warning signal for us to pay attention to on how, if we get our assumptions wrong, things can rapidly get out of hand. We're lucky, as bad as it is right now, with the Strait of Hormuz closed and the global economy in a very uncertain place. We need to take this as a warning sign.
Well, thanks for going into that, because it was the next question, which was the question everyone's been waiting for, I think, to ask, in a certain sense, of some of these thoughts, which I would timestamp as Monday, March 16th at 1:30 p.m. so that we don't get ahead of ourselves in any way. But I don't think you said anything that will outdate any of this at this time. And I guess to kind of bring this a little forward, to apply your, I guess, framework in this way of the global operating system there. How do you think about it in terms of what should we be paying attention to from now on, in the middle of this conflict? These nodes or notices or indicators of decline, or things that we should be concerned about, either from the perspective of domestic politics or international order in that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things I would get into. One is the system I described earlier for decisions on the use of national instruments of power, to include force. Normally, you use that system before you take an action, and you go, okay, is the correspondence here, or whatever, the correlation, strong, and therefore how much of those 5 risks am I willing to take? Well, it's kind of interesting at this point, 3 weeks into this conflict, to kind of go in reverse order and ask ourselves, what risks of those are we actually taking, and what kind of correlation does that imply? So if you look at them in order, are we acting unilaterally? Basically, yes. We're acting with Israel, but none of our traditional allies are with us, and none of our traditional partners are with us, except to the extent that they need to defend themselves. But they're even reluctant about providing ships to help escort tankers to the Gulf. Acting unilaterally, that's a big cost in blood. Fortunately, we haven't paid too great of a price yet, although we pray for the families of the people we've lost, but it's not a massive loss yet. Treasure, $10 billion a week, plus the long-term effects of a crisis like this on readiness and how much you have to pay to recover it. Very expensive war. In terms of opportunity costs, certainly there's some real-time opportunity costs where if something else were to happen around the globe today, we would have a harder time reacting to it. But there's also a downstream opportunity cost where we're using a lot of high-end weapons that are going to be very hard and costly and time-consuming to replenish. And then pushing against international law, we've thrown that out the window, and domestic law as well. I mean, this is so much against international law, it's hard to buy. So all of that would tend to lead me to think, if I were a Martian looking at this, I'd say, boy, there must have been some really high correlation there with U.S. national interests, highly ranked interests, or many interests, or deeply affected interests. And I don't find that, which tells me is an indication to me that we perhaps should have found other methods, other ways, other elements of national power to take this a little further before we used force. So I think it's a really good lesson in have a system that governs you, that prevents you from making mistakes. That can, it's much easier to get into a war than it is to get out of a war. So that's one thing that I would say, and I'll probably leave it at that. There are other structures I can use to outline some of the challenges with what we're doing today. Interestingly, the principles that I would use to make sure that I was operating the nuclear propulsion plants safely on my carrier, there are 6 of those principles. They actually apply to the strategic planning and campaign planning level. If you adhere to the principles in both places, you're probably going to be okay.
So bringing us back to kind of, the current crisis, and then thinking about future crises, should we be dispensing with thinking about a rules-based system as even a framework? We have a lot of discussion that says, well, this is from an era in kind of U.S. national security thinking that has passed. Is thinking instead about global operating system perhaps a way to reground our assessment of what U.S. global engagement ought to be around a set of concepts and around a tagline, a bumper sticker that may in fact have more buy-in moving forward, as opposed to a term like the rules-based system, which now seems dated in its use, and perhaps now has been sucked into this domestic political divide, not only here in the U.S. but in other countries as well.
Yeah, Nick, it's a good question, and I think that the if it appears dated, it's because we have made it appear dated. And if you look back in history, when a system doesn't exist, such as during World War II, and really the rule of power is rampant rather than the rule of law and other things, standards, organizations, that kind of thing. It's really bloody. Humans are not good at operating without a system. And so I think if I were, and you can ask, well, why did we let this happen? And I think part of it has to do with those factors I mentioned earlier that cause the prevailing power to decline. And if it's sort of, if we can get our own house in order with primary education, with all the things that make us strong, we can probably push really, really hard to get back, push, it seems retrograde, but I really like that international system. It worked, and it kept us safe, and it kept us prosperous. And now we're looking through a glass darkly. And I think that the place I do not want to be is in a world without a system, whether it's voluntary or mandatory. I think it's pretty much voluntary on the part of the prevailing power, as I mentioned. I would like to see either this administration or a successor administration say to the world, we're going to get our house in order inside, so that we can be, the strongest nation. No strong nation ever had a weak economy, and we are going to restore what we have lost, or what we're losing now. We will operate under the rule of law. We will support our allies and partners, because the leader always does more than the led. All those things. I would like to see us, kind of arrest this decline and cure the patient, rather than trying to, do major surgery.
As we wrap up, what is one question, or feel free to ask multiple questions, but we'll let you off the hook and ask one question if you want, you think policymakers and analysts should be asking right now that's not receiving enough attention?
I think perhaps there are many of them, but one of them would be, how do we educate the American people to think for themselves, and to think for themselves wisely? And now, wisely is a term of art. It's in the eye of the beholder. Who's wise on the right, who's wise on the left. I'm talking about just being able to think for themselves. And I'll tell you, guys, whenever I give a talk to a large organization about what's going on in the world, I tell them, you remember the old adage about give a man a fish and feed him for a day, and teach a man to fish and he'll sit in a boat all day long and drink beer? What I say, I could take you on a tour of the world and tell you what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening with China, Taiwan, what's happening with Iran, and that's perishable over a couple of days or a week, right? What I always start with, I said, I'm going to make you work a little harder as an audience, and I'm going to try to teach you something that you can use for yourself. It's not a politically driven thing that will allow you to make your own decisions about should the nation use force or whatever, national instruments of power. So I walk them through that system. I sometimes walk them through the end of the geopolitical, cycle, and what those really mean, and it's something we all need to be aware of, because I really want the audiences to think for themselves. So I think that's the $64,000 question, is how do we get our education system? How do we get our media getting the average American to think more strategically, rather than what is currently being yelled at them by either the far left or the far right on social media and 24-hour news media.
Well, thanks so much. We've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I think you've really also probably enlightened our audience and on some of these concepts that you discussed. And I encourage everyone to read the piece, go to Sandy's Substack, listen to Adrenaline Zone, everything he's done, and every time he enlightens us about world politics, or even teaching us, which is actually a valuable lesson, which I had never thought about before, as opposed to just kind of spoon feeding an audience, but getting them to think a little bit more, is actually a great practice to have in mind. So
thank you. And it reinforces the FPRI motto, which is to make America think again. And so getting people to think rather than just telling them the answers is what produces a more informed citizenry. And that's what I think in the end leads to better outcomes. So thank you again, not only for your long service, but also your contributions to helping to shape the minds and perspectives of our readers, our audiences, and of up-and-coming professionals in the national security field.
This has been an episode of Shifting Ground, a podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs. For more information about the articles mentioned in this episode, please visit us at orbisjournal.org. Until next time.